Hi, I want to talk to you today about John Calvin's views on ethics, and especially on meta-ethics, on the nature of our ethical knowledge. So we're going to talk not only about the content, normatively, of what ethics is all about for Calvin, but also how it's possible for us to have any idea how to live our lives. That basic question of ethics, what do I do? That is a basic, fundamental question of philosophy in general. But it's not an easy one to answer. It's one that has an intimate connection to religion, Calvin thinks, but it's also one that therefore encounters all sorts of problems. We've talked about the fact that in Calvin you need two philosophies for everything. You need a pre-lapsarian and a post-lapsarian philosophy. A philosophy before the fall and a philosophy after the fall. As we'll see, Calvin gives us two very different meta-ethical accounts for before the fall and after the fall. So, as with most things in Calvin, we really need two answers to ethical questions and two answers to meta-ethical questions about the nature of ethics and about the nature of ethical knowledge. Now, these questions of ethics are intimately connected to questions about our knowledge of ourselves. Knowing what to do is only part of it. In fact, as I see it, there are three basic questions of ethics. What do I do? What kind of person should I be? And how do I decide? Well, that question, what kind of person I should be, is really a question that depends on an account of human nature. I can't know what kind of person I should be until I understand something about what human beings are, what my nature is. What is it to be a human being? And then maybe I can approach the question of, well, what it is to be a good human being. So it looks as if I need some knowledge of myself, some knowledge of human nature, in order to even begin to answer that kind of ethical question. And of course, there's an intimate connection between the question of what kind of person I should be and the question of what I should do in various particular situations. Presumably, whatever we think the exact connection is between those issues, there's some connection. I don't want to give an answer to the question of what kind of person I should be. That means I'm constantly doing the wrong thing. Nor do I want to give an account that says, well, here's what you ought to do, but of course it's going to turn you into some kind of vicious monster. And so I doubt that one of these questions simply reduces to the other. Nevertheless, they do seem connected. And so even the question, what should I do, is something that seems to require us to have some understanding of human nature. Can we know ourselves? It's an ancient principle, know thyself. It was inscribed on the oracle at Delphi. It's something that Socrates and other ancient philosophers refer to repeatedly. Know thyself. It seems like a fundamental commandment. But is it even possible? Can I have self-knowledge? And if so, to what extent? Maybe I can know some things about myself and not others. Well, before the fall, Calvin says, we consist of intellect and will working together. In general, not always, but in general, intellect and will work together. And so we're capable of knowing something about ourselves intellectually, also something about our will. We can understand our strengths and weaknesses. We're capable of, by and large, overcoming the temptation. Now, as the fall itself indicates, we don't always succeed, even before the fall. But nevertheless, for the most part, there is a kind of harmony in the soul. And in particular, that harmony consists in the will choosing what the intellect considers best. In short, we are normally able to do the better, or at least what we judge to be the better, before the fall. After the fall, it's very different. We become weak-willed. Both intellect and will become obscured. We no longer have a very good judgment about what's better and what's worse, so already we're obscured. We can't judge the better from the worse very accurately at all. But then the will, too, has been corrupted. And so the will often doesn't follow intellect. We can judge that this thing is better and do the other thing. Suggests Ovid's definition of weakness of will. We choose the worse even though we know the better. That idea that we can know the better and do the worse seems bizarre. Technically possible before the fall. But on the other hand, you could argue that even Adam and Eve didn't know the better. They knew what God commanded them to do, but the serpent managed to convince them that eating the apple was better. After the fall, it's not just a question of our mistakenly thinking that this is the better option. We often think that option is better and do the opposite. And so one thing to know about ourselves after the fall is that we are now fundamentally weak-willed. We no longer have a very good understanding of what our own interests are, so we're constantly misjudging that. But even when we make a judgment that's correct, we often let our wills diverge from that, and so do the thing that we don't judge to be the better option. Before the fall, Calvin writes, God provided the soul of man with intellect, by which he might discern good from evil, just from unjust, and might know what to follow or to shun, reason going before with her lamp. Man excelled in these noble endowments in his primitive condition, when reason, intelligence, prudence, and judgment not only sufficed for the government of his earthly life, but also enabled him to rise up to God in eternal happiness. Thereafter, choice was added to direct the appetites, and temper all the organic motions, the will being thus perfectly submissive to the authority of reason. But then the fall. Then giving in to temptation in the garden. Original sin, then, he says, may be defined a hereditary corruption and depravity of our nature, extending to all parts of the soul, which first makes us obnoxious to the wrath of God, and then produces in us works which in Scripture are termed works of the flesh. Paul himself leaves no room for doubt when he says that corruption does not dwell in one part only, but that no part is free from its deadly taint. For speaking of corrupt nature, he not only condemns the inordinate nature of the appetites, but in particular declares that the understanding is subjected to blindness and the heart to depravity. So it is both intellect and will that have suffered as a result of the fall. Both have been corrupted, both have become depraved. Both are now degraded and no longer capable of what they were capable of before the fall. Before the fall, we were capable of knowing good and evil, and our wills followed that knowledge. We were capable of knowing what was good and actually doing it. After the fall, we're no longer capable of discerning good from evil very well at all. We can't tell the better from the worse. And even when we make a judgment about what's better, our will doesn't obey. We become weak-willed. We are constantly knowing, or at least believing, something to be better and doing the worse. Well, that's a weakness of intellect and a weakness of will. But now there's an obvious problem that Calvin's account indicates, and I've already alluded to it and suggested it. If before the fall, intellect and will were perfectly aligned, we had a knowledge of good and evil, and the will followed our knowledge of what was good, how did Adam and Eve fall in the first place? How do we account for the fall itself? It looks like we were in an ideal situation in the garden, so what on earth happened? What brought about this corruption, this depravity? How did they make the wrong choice then? Calvin gives an interesting account of this. He doesn't actually say, well, it wasn't invariable. We pretty well knew, but not completely knew what was good. And the will pretty well followed reason, but not completely. That's not the kind of account he gives. Instead, he says, Adam's sin was infidelity. Not a matter of misjudging goods and evils or weakness of will, but disobedience, putting his own judgment above God's. So here's the idea. The serpent comes along and says, eat of the fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. God forbade it, and God said, if you eat of that, surely you will die. The serpent says, you won't die. It'll be great. In fact, your eyes will be opened. You'll become like God. Now, God commanded that it not be done. But Adam and Eve say, well, looks good. Okay. They make the intellectual judgment that it would be good for them. A knowledge of good and evil? Well, But notice what they were doing. They were making a judgment that it was good. And in some ways, they were right. That's the thing. The serpent wasn't entirely lying. They didn't die. They got expelled from the garden. They badly damaged themselves. Both intellect and will suffered catastrophic injury. But they didn't die. It was good to eat. It tasted good. They did get a knowledge of good and evil. Well, sort of. I mean, their eyes were open. They saw that they were naked. They had now a greater intellectual ability in a way, even though the intellect got badly damaged in other ways. The problem, in short, wasn't really with their judgment. It wasn't weakness of will. It wasn't that, oh, yeah, look, I know I shouldn't do this, but it wasn't like that. They made the judgment that they should do it. So this really wasn't weakness of will in the garden, according to Calvin. They made the judgment that it was better to eat the fruit. And they did eat the fruit. So they didn't know the better and do the worse. They actually chose what they thought was better. Was it a failure of intellect? Well, in a way, but not really. They judged it to be good, and it was good. That is to say, they thought it would look tasty, and it was tasty. They thought it would open their eyes, and it did open their eyes. What was the nature of the sin? They should have listened to God. It was disobedience. It was not weakness of will. It was not really a failure of intellect. And so Calvin says, yeah, the problem in the garden wasn't really a failure epistemically. It wasn't a failure of knowledge, nor was it a failure of will. It was something else. Intellect and will were just fine. This is an error we have to chalk up to something else. They disobeyed God. They were given a direct order, don't do it, and they did it. That's a different kind of sin, a different kind of problem. And so Calvin is really saying, look, most problems in ethics arise from failures of intellect or failures of will. This wasn't either one of those. This wasn't like the kind of failure we have where we think that's going to be the better option and it's not. It wasn't the kind of failure where we think that's the better option, but we end up doing something else because we give in to temptation. This is something different. This is a question of rank disobedience. And that's something that has a different kind of character. Badly damages the intellect, badly damages the will. But it wasn't really a failure of either one of those initially. They were in fine shape beforehand. This does not reveal a flaw in intellect or will. It reveals a different kind of flaw. So Calvin says, it undoubtedly follows that your life is sadly corrupted, if it is not framed in obedience to him, since his will ought to be the law of our lives. On the other hand, your idea of his nature is not clear unless you acknowledge him to be the origin and fountain of all goodness. Hence would arise both confidence in him and a desire of cleaving to him, did not the depravity of the human mind lead it away from the proper course of investigation. This has important implications for ethical knowledge. The divine law is written on the heart, he says. It is not only that we have a sense of the divine that gives us some innate awareness of God. We actually have God's law written on our heart. It is not only there revealed in Scripture, it is written on the heart. We have innate knowledge of right and wrong, of good and evil. And that is something we had access to fully in the garden. But now that has become obscured. Our innate knowledge is still there. But it's general for one thing. It has to be applied in particular contexts. But even more seriously, it is now hard for us to discern it. It is still there, but it has to be recovered. It is not something that glows forth in a very clear lettering to us. Instead, it's there, but dimly written and obscured. The dust has covered it in such a way that it is hard for us to read. So, Calvin says, that homicide, putting the case in the abstract, is an evil no man will deny. And yet one who is conspiring the death of his enemy deliberates on it as if the thing was good. The adulterer will condemn adultery in the abstract, yet flatter himself while privately committing it. The ignorance lies here, that man, when he comes to the particular, forgets the rule which he had laid down in the general case. Kant makes the point that the essence of immorality is making an exception for ourselves. Not having the awareness that murder is wrong, that adultery is wrong. After all, he says, the murderer doesn't want to be killed, the thief doesn't want to be robbed, the adulterer doesn't want to be cuckolded. But instead, this is a question of making an exception for yourself. Knowing the general rule, but somehow not applying it to this particular case. And Calvin says precisely, it is a question of being able to read enough of what's written in the heart that we're capable of understanding basic things like murder is wrong, adultery is wrong. However, in a particular case, we tend to misapply them. We tend to think that somehow we're exceptions, that this case is an exception, that these are unusual circumstances. And so we find ways of letting that knowledge become obscured in particular cases. Hence the problem of weakness of will. Calvin cites Ovid here. He says, the turpitude of the crime sometimes presses so on the conscience that the sinner does not impose upon himself by a false semblance of good, but rushes into sin knowingly and willingly. Hence the expression, I see the better course and approve it. I follow the worse. And he mentions Ovid. This is an idea that we've talked about quite a bit. Plato, Socrates, Aristotle, all advanced theories of weakness of will, of akrasia. in the Greek, of trying to explain how this is possible. Socrates chalks it up to ignorance. We don't really know the better. Plato says it's as if there are two things in us that are at war with one another. Reason goes to war with desire or emotion, as if they're distinct things pulling us in different directions. Aristotle says, well, it's as if we are drunk or asleep and forget the general thing that we actually do know. All of these are things that Calvin says are in a sense right, but in a sense wrong. We have that general knowledge, but we don't apply it in a particular case. And so we could say that in that case we're ignorant of the fact that this is a case where we should be applying the general rule. It is often something that is overcome, or that is to say that knowledge is overcome by desire or emotion or something else about that particular case. But Calvin says it's not quite the full account in any of those cases. Even our general knowledge is flawed. If we would test our reason by the divine law, which is a perfect standard of righteousness, we should find out how blind it is in many respects. Before the fall, we knew right from wrong. We had direct knowledge of good and evil, of justice and injustice. We had a direct knowledge of God's commands. Adam and Eve knew what God commanded, knew that God commanded that they not eat of the fruit of that tree, but they did it anyway. God's commands were written on the heart, and we could read them clearly before the fall. We knew general truths, we could apply them. But after the fall, the law is still written on the heart. We still have some a priori knowledge of general ethical truths, but we have trouble applying them. We find that we frequently end up weak of will. We're no longer capable of discerning the divine will. We can no longer really sense what God's commands are or understand how to apply them in our lives if we read them in Scripture. We have trouble reading what's even written on our own heart. And when we try to apply them to particular cases, we get confused. We forget these general truths, or we misapply them. We don't understand how they relate to the situation we actually face. So before the fall, we had an immediate knowledge of the good, an innate immediate knowledge of the good. After the fall, there is some innate ethical knowledge still there. So Calvin ends up, I think, here a moderate rationalist. We still have some degree of innate knowledge, but it's vague, it's hard for us to make out, we frequently misapply it. We end up no longer having the kind of direct, foundational, and certain access to ethical truth that we had before the fall. That means that after the fall, everything we do is filled with moral risk. It's not that we have no idea what's right and what's wrong, but our ability to apply that, both because of intellectual understanding and because of the weakness of the will, turns out to be problematic. We live very dangerously, to quote Anselm again, because everything we do is full of moral risk. Our intellects are badly damaged, so is our will, and consequently, even though we have the law written on the heart, we find that our hands are frequently doing wrong.